hello to all of our friends out there. Good to be with you. COP28, the Conference of Parties, confab, that was there to discuss climate change and the policies tied to it, just wrapped up. It's hard to believe there's been 28 of these already, but there have been. And all the theatrics and all the posturing that you typically see with climate change theater was on full display during COP28. But now that it's wrapped up, how would a rational thinker navigate through where we sit today with respect to both climate change and then the policies that are tied to them? It's a great question, or pair of questions, and that's why we prepared this trilogy of videos. So we're rolling out the first one today, and what we're looking to do is to sort of begin by diagnosing the problem and the issue. And diagnosis is actually the perfect term for what we should be doing, because the term diagnosis, it makes you think of data and math, science, logical thinking. And unfortunately, those things have been jettisoned. They've been let go. And they've been let go in a way with regard to assessing what is the most important issue facing our time. And the most important issue facing our time, at least from my perspective, isn't necessarily climate change itself, but instead the poor policies, the inept policies that are being pushed upon society by the climate alarmist movement. That's the most pressing issue of our time. So it brings to mind the definition that I read once of a religious writer. And what they wrote about this individual was that he was a professional preacher whose business was his words. And indeed, what we're seeing today when it comes to climate policies are preachers of a religion, an increasingly intolerant one, who are replacing that math and data, science, etc., and in their places, they're putting in creative writing, phraseology, etc., to create a visual of what might be proposed to be happening. And what are the phrases that we hear? You know them as well as I do, right? It's things like code red, tipping point, existential threat. Our United Nations Secretary General is very creative in this arena, coming up with terms like the highway to climate hell, and either the boiling or broiling planet use of words. And when you look at what's going on with respect to assessing the policies when it comes to climate change, what we need to get back to are the rational thoughts as to what we know, what the math tells us, what science is telling us. So how would you navigate through that? Well, from the perspective of climate change itself, it's happening. It's been happening for millions of years. It's an accepted fact. It will be happening as long as there is a planet Earth. And the second thing we know with respect to climate change occurring and always occurring is that during prior periods of history, well before the start of the Industrial Revolution, when human beings figured out how to harness the magical power of that carbon atom, the swings that we've seen in climate, the extent of climate change, had been much more severe than what we've seen the past couple hundred of years since the advent of the Industrial Revolution. So I'll give you 3 quick examples of that. You go back to around 5,000 years ago. Up until then, the Florida Keys were completely underwater for substantial periods of time because of sea levels during those periods of time. You go back to the time of Christ, in the Mediterranean region, sea levels were significantly higher than they are today, and temperatures were significantly higher than what we see today. But yet that Roman Empire, it found a way to flourish in spite of those challenges. And then at about 1000 AD, there were Vikings in Greenland doing what? They were farming. You don't farm in Greenland today because of climate. The other sort of accepted fact out there with respect to climate change is that atmospheric carbon dioxide has indeed increased since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So it's gone from give or take about 200 parts per million up to about 400 parts per million today. Now that, again, is an accepted pair or set of facts, but what people often misunderstand or don't appreciate fully is what that parts per million metric tells us in terms of proportion. So an easy way to understand that, I put it into the sports analogy or sports context. If you've got a college football game and you have 100,000 people in the stadium watching the game, a 200 parts per million concentration of, let's call it, visiting fans versus home fans, a 200 parts per million proportion of those 100,000 people are only 20 spectators in the stands. So clearly that crowd 99,980 of them are home fans and 20 of them are visiting fans. That's a home crowd. If you double that proportion to 400 parts per million, indeed, the number of visiting fans has doubled. It's gone up significantly from the context of where it started, 20 to now 40 fans. But again, it's only 40 out of 100,000 fans in total. Has the nature or the atmosphere of that crowd, so to speak, changed to any observable extent? Probably not. What else do we know? Well, we know that despite those CO2 levels going up over the past couple hundred years, climate-related deaths globally have plummeted. They're down 95%, give or take, over the past century. And that's a significant improvement, despite, I might add, human beings concentrating themselves more and more near waterways and oceans, which would increase the exposure to weather-related events. And we also know that more people die globally from extreme cold, many more, than from extreme heat every year. So if you believe that global warming is occurring, or you can measure the extent of it, net, that should be an improvement with respect to loss of life, not making things worse, net, with respect to loss of life. What else do we know? We also know that there has been innovation with respect to the shale revolution, most of it in the West, so most of it in places like the United States, North America, Europe, that made natural gas much more plentiful and abundant and lower cost to produce. And once that happened through the private sector, natural gas displaced enormous amounts of coal in the power generation grid. And that's reduced CO2 emissions tremendously. Single biggest source of CO2 reduction over the past 30 years. And again, that wasn't from government, and that wasn't from mandates, and that wasn't from regulation, and it certainly wasn't from wind and solar. That was from the private sector innovating with disruptive technology to bring more natural gas to the market and across our energy grids. Pennsylvania, my home state, is an awesome example of this. Since 2005, because of natural gas production largely from the Marcellus Shale and the Utica Shale, the CO2 emissions in state have dropped over 40%. And again, that's a material and significant improvement. But while all that was going on, we also know, using rational thought and looking at the facts out there, that the Indias and the Chinas of the world, the developing world, so to speak, they're running to and using more coal than ever. And they're going to continue on that trajectory. And frankly, I'm not sure we can blame them, because what are they after? They're after reliable and affordable energy access for all their citizens. And who doesn't want that? And then finally, the other sort of list or group of things that we know when navigating through the facts regarding climate change, they sort of speak to what's going on with so-called renewables. And renewables, that name in and of itself is very misleading. In many ways, it's false advertising, because there's nothing renewable about wind or solar when you look at the nature of each. But what do we know? Well, we do know that wind and solar are not zero carbon or zero carbon dioxide emitting sources of energy. They're anything but. When you take a look at the full supply chain and life cycle assessment of what it takes to produce a kilowatt hour from solar or for wind at scale, those carbon dioxide footprints, those carbon footprints are egregious. And I would put forth that they're higher than what you would find from things like natural gas-fired power generation, and certainly from things like nuclear. We also know that those sources, wind and solar, they suffer from very low energy density, which means it's really difficult to scale them without the associated ecological damage. So if you think about the amount of wind turbines or the acreage of solar panels needed to pursue or achieve something like the Biden administration's net zero plan or Europe's net zero plans, you would need to basically blanket entire states within this union with either solar farms or wind farms, which of course doesn't make much sense, isn't very practical. And then last but not least, with wind and solar, we know there's cost issues, but we also know that they will be bringing with them, with their scaling up efforts, some serious ecological issues and negative ecological impacts. The best examples that we're seeing today are with wind generation. Offshore wind, all kinds of issues arising with regard to whale kills up and down the east coast of the United States. And with onshore wind, when you look at what's going on with endangered species of birds and bird kills, the worst thing to happen to birds since the cat. So these are sort of the facts that a rational person navigating through what do we know about climate change, what do we know about climate change policies, would want to assess and stack up when getting to the next step, which we'll discuss in our second video, which is getting into the cures and the medicines that are being prescribed by the experts and the elites out there. Are those cures and medicines worse than the symptoms or the ailments that climate change will bring with it?